Everyone's telling you 2026 is finally the year to buy a house. Mortgage rates are dropping, affordability is improving, and experts are calling it the Great Housing Reset. But what if I told you that buying a house in 2026 could be one of the biggest financial mistakes of your life? Here's what nobody's telling you. While mortgage rates might drop from 6.6% to 6.3%, and while you might think you're getting a deal, you're walking straight into a trap that could cost you over $500,000 in lost wealth. And I'm not just talking about the mortgage payment. See, most people look at buying a house and they think, okay, I can afford the monthly payment, I'll build equity, and real estate always goes up. That's the American dream, right? But there are 5 hidden financial landmines in 2026 that real estate agents will never tell you about. Things like the $16,000 in annual hidden costs that Zillow just revealed, or the opportunity cost of missing out on stock market gains that could dwarf your home appreciation, or the fact that if you buy in 2026, you're in the highest risk group for negative equity. I spent the last week analyzing every major housing forecast from Redfin, Zillow, NAR, and Realtor.com. I crunched the numbers on opportunity costs, I looked at the data on who's actually winning in this market, and what I found shocked me. The wealthy and seasoned investors, they're sitting this one out, and there's a reason why. In this video, I'm breaking down exactly why 2026 is a trap year for home buyers, what the real costs are that nobody talks about, and what you should do with your money instead. By the end, you'll see why waiting or investing differently could make you hundreds of thousands of dollars richer. The $16,000 hidden cost trap. But there's one thing about buying a house in 2026 that real estate agents will never tell you, and it's by far the most overlooked cost that could destroy your budget. Picture this. You're looking at houses, you find one you love, you run the mortgage calculator, and you think, great, I can afford $2,500 a month. So you buy the house. Fast forward 6 months and you're drowning. Why? Because nobody told you about the real costs. Most people think homeownership is just the mortgage payment. Maybe they remember to factor in property taxes and insurance. But here's what Zillow and Thumbtack just revealed in their latest study. The hidden costs of owning a home now add up to nearly $16,000 per year. That's $1,300 extra every single month that you probably didn't budget for. Let me break this down so you can see the trap. This $16,000 doesn't even include your mortgage payment, property taxes, or insurance. This is on top of all of that. So what makes up this $16,000? It's maintenance, repairs, HOA fees in many areas, utilities that are higher than renting, landscaping, pest control, appliance replacements, HVAC servicing, and all the little emergencies that pop up like a leaking roof or a broken water heater. And here's the kicker. These costs are climbing faster than people's incomes. The data shows that home maintenance expenses have been increasing at a rate that outpaces wage growth. So while your salary might go up 3% next year, your home ownership costs are going up by 5 or 7% in many markets. So let me recap what we're talking about here. The opportunity cost of buying a home in 2026 instead of renting and investing is potentially $346 million over 30 years. That's the cost of tying up your money in a house instead of letting it work for you in the stock market. Now I know what you're thinking. But I'm building equity in my home. Yes, you are. But let's look at what that actually means in 2026. Home prices are only expected to rise about 1 to 2% according to most forecasts. After inflation, your home is barely keeping up with the cost of living. Meanwhile, the stock market has historically returned 10% per year after inflation. And here's another thing people don't realize. When you calculate home equity, you can't just look at appreciation. You have to subtract all the costs, the mortgage interest you paid, the property taxes, the maintenance, the insurance, the transaction costs when you eventually sell. Financial Samurai, a personal finance expert, calculated the true cost of homeownership and found that when you factor in opportunity cost, the baseline is always the risk-free rate of return. Right now, that's around 4 to 5% in treasury bonds. So, at a minimum, by tying up your money in a house instead of treasuries, you're giving up guaranteed returns. But let's bring this back to 2026 specifically. Why is this year particularly bad? Because you're getting the worst of both worlds. Home prices are still elevated from the pandemic surge. They're not crash level cheap. And mortgage rates at 6.3% are still historically high, meaning you're paying massive amounts of interest. Let me show you the math on a $420,000 home with 20% down at 6.3% interest. Over 30 years, you will pay $400,000 in interest alone. That's almost as much as the house costs. And that $400,000 in interest is money that could have been invested and compounding for 3 decades. Here's a study from Exploring Finance that compared renting and investing versus home ownership over 30 years. The results? In almost every scenario, especially with modest home appreciation, like we're seeing forecasted for 2026, the renting and investing approach built significantly more wealth. The wealthy understand this. That's why many millionaires rent their primary residence and invest their capital elsewhere. They're not emotional about housing, they're mathematical about wealth building. So when someone tells you that renting is throwing money away, remember this. Tying up hundreds of thousands of dollars in a house while paying massive interest to a bank might be the biggest waste of money instead. But wait, it gets even worse for 2026 buyers specifically because there's a unique risk that economists are now warning about: the negative equity trap for 2026 buyers. Here's something that should terrify anyone thinking about buying in 2026. And it's a risk that didn't exist for buyers in 2020 or 2021. It's called negative equity. And First American's chief economist Mark Fleming is ringing the alarm bells about it right now. Let me explain what this means and why 2026 buyers are in the danger zone. Negative equity is when you owe more on your mortgage than your home is worth. And here's why 2026 is particularly dangerous. You're buying near a price peak, but appreciation is slowing to almost nothing. Look at the data. Home prices surged over 40% during the pandemic years of 2020-2022. People who bought then, even though they paid high prices, they've built equity because prices kept rising. But forecasts for 2026 show home prices will only rise 1–2%. And in 22 major markets, prices are actually expected to decline. Now here's the trap. If you buy in 2026 with a low down payment, let's say 5 to 10%, because that's what many first-time buyers do, and then prices decline even slightly or stay flat, you're immediately underwater or close to it. Fleming warns that more recent buyers who bought at the top of the market with little down and missed the benefit of the pandemic price surge are the most at risk of being in negative equity. And guess what? 2026 buyers are exactly those people. Let's look at a real scenario. You buy a $420,000 home in 2026 with a 5% down payment. That's $21,000 down. After closing costs and immediate depreciation from buying the home at retail price, your actual equity might be closer to $10,000. If home prices drop just 2 to 3% in your market, which is happening in multiple cities, you're now underwater. You owe more than the house is worth. Why does this matter? Because if something happens, you lose your job, you need to relocate, there's a family emergency, you can't sell the house without bringing cash to the closing table. You're trapped. And here's the broader economic risk. Redfin, Zillow, and other forecasters are all warning about economic uncertainties in 2026. They mention policy changes, potential tariff impacts, labor market softness, and the fact that AI is taking a toll on white-collar jobs? If the economy weakens and you bought a house with thin equity, you're in a very vulnerable position. Fleming specifically says lenders will be closely monitoring mortgages for negative equity risk. That's not a good sign. When economists start talking about monitoring for negative equity, it means they see it as a real possibility. Now contrast this with people who bought in 2020, 2021. Yes, they paid high prices, but they've built substantial equity as prices rose. They have a cushion. They can weather a downturn. But 2026 buyers? They're buying at the tail end of the run-up with minimal appreciation ahead and all the downside risk. Markets in Florida, Texas, California, especially the Sun Belt regions that surged during the pandemic, are already seeing price corrections. If you buy in these markets in 2026, you're catching a falling knife. The data is clear. More price declines are forecast for 22 major markets in 2026 than in 2025. You'd be buying right into that correction. And if all of this wasn't enough to make you reconsider, there's one more factor that makes 2026 uniquely terrible for homebuyers. The rate lock-in delusion-keeping inventory fake low. Here's something bizarre happening in the 2026 housing market that's creating a false sense of urgency, and most buyers don't even realize they're being manipulated by it. It's called the rate lock-in effect, and it's artificially suppressing inventory, making you think houses are scarce when they're actually not. Here's how it works. About 80% of current homeowners have mortgage rates below 6%. Many locked in rates at 3% or below during the pandemic. These people don't want to sell because if they buy a new house, they'd have to get a mortgage at 6.3% or higher. So what happens? They stay put, they don't list their homes, inventory stays low. And when inventory is low, prices stay artificially elevated. Here's the trap for you as a buyer. You look at the market, you see limited inventory, and you think, I better buy now before there's nothing left. But that's exactly the wrong conclusion. Rick Sharga, CEO of C.J. Patrick Company, explains that we're in the third year of a 5-year reset period. The market is slowly adjusting to higher prices and higher rates. Eventually, probably in 2027 or 2028, either prices will come down enough, or rates will drop enough, or people's circumstances will force them to sell. When that happens, inventory will flood the market. And guess what happens to prices when inventory surges? They drop. So if you buy in 2026, because you're panicking about low inventory, you might find yourself a year or two later watching prices fall as all those rate-locked homeowners finally enter the market. First American's economist Mark Fleming confirms that the rate lock-in effect will remain a headwind holding back transaction volume in 2026. Translation, the market is still frozen, and when it unfreezes, there will be a correction. Think about it logically. All these people with 3% mortgages are aging. Life events happen, divorce, death, job relocation, downsizing needs. Eventually, they have to sell regardless of rates. And when they do, inventory will normalize and prices will adjust accordingly. But here's what makes this particularly unfair to 2026 buyers. You're buying into an artificially constrained market. You're paying inflated prices not because there's genuine scarcity, but because of a temporary lock-in effect. And what's worse? The people creating this false scarcity, current homeowners with low rates, they're the ones who would actually be selling to you at elevated prices. They're sitting on massive equity gains from the pandemic surge, and when they do eventually sell, they'll cash out big, while you're left holding the bag with minimal appreciation potential. The smart play is to wait until this lock-in effect breaks and inventory normalizes. Don't be the buyer who overpays because of artificial scarcity. So what's the bottom line here? Let me bring this all together. Who should actually buy in 2026 and what everyone else should do, here's the reality check that nobody else will give you straight. For 99% of people, buying a house in 2026 is a bad financial decision. But there is a 1% scenario where it makes sense, and I need to be honest about that. You should only buy a house in 2026 if all of these conditions are true. 1, you're planning to stay in that house for at least 10, 15 years. 2, you have a 20% down payment or more saved up. 3, your total housing costs would be no more than 25% of your gross income. 4, you have a stable job that's not at risk from AI or economic changes. And 5, you have 6 months of expenses in an emergency fund on top of your down payment. If you meet all 5 of those criteria, okay, buying might make sense for you. But here's the thing. Most people watching this video don't meet all 5, especially Gen Z and young millennials who are being told by real estate agents that they need to buy now. NAR predicts home sales will jump 14% in 2026, and all those sales are going to first-time buyers with low down payments who are about to learn the hard way about negative equity and hidden costs. So what should you do instead? Here's the simple answer. Keep renting, take the money you would have used for a down payment and closing costs, invest it in a diversified portfolio of index funds, and let compound growth work for you. Take the monthly difference between your rent and what a mortgage would cost and invest that too. Do this consistently for the next few years while watching the housing market. When rates drop below 5%, or when prices correct by 10-15%, or when inventory normalizes, that's when you consider buying. But in 2026, the math doesn't work. The risks are too high, the opportunity costs are too great, and remember, the wealthy don't buy houses to build wealth, they buy assets that generate cash flow and appreciate significantly. For most people, the best wealth-building move is to stay lean on housing costs and invest aggressively in appreciating assets. So we've covered the 5 reasons why buying a house in 2026 is a trap. The $16,000 in hidden annual costs that will destroy your budget. The $500,000 plus opportunity cost of not investing in the stock market. The negative equity risk specifically for 2026 buyers. The rate lock-in delusion creating false scarcity. And who should actually buy versus what everyone else should do. These are the exact strategies that wealthy investors are using to build millions while everyone else is throwing money away on overpriced houses. But here's something I didn't tell you at the start of this video. Everything I just shared is completely useless if you don't understand how to actually invest that money instead. Without knowing where to put your capital and how to build a wealth-generating portfolio, you could end up just as broke as the person who bought the house. Click this video over here where I break down exactly how to build wealth through investing in 2026 and the specific assets that will outperform real estate. I'll see you in the next one.